It's a very good time to be a Godzilla fan. The biggest Japanese monster of all time on the big screen again for American audiences, and this time we'll get to see Mothra, Rodan, and King Ghidorah. But if you want to know what that's all about, where it all came from, you want to catch up on all the Japanese Godzilla films, well, that's easy. There's only 29. With different timelines and continuity, monsters are introduced in separate films, then cross over. This one's set in the future, this one's a dream, and these ones Godzilla's a villain, and these one's a hero. Outside Japan, the titles were changed 1,000 times. Some were drastically re-edited for American audiences. Mothra versus Godzilla is not to be confused with Godzilla versus Mothra. King Kong versus Godzilla is not to be mistaken with the upcoming Godzilla versus Kong. Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2 is actually the third to feature Mechagodzilla and different from Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. Then there's Destroy All Monsters Attack, Giant Monsters All Out Attack, god damn! And don't forget the Zone Fighter series, the anime trilogy, and while we're at it, the animated series based on Godzilla 98. How many are called Godzilla now? Godzilla 54, Godzilla 84, which is called Godzilla 1985 in the USA. Then there's Godzilla 98, Godzilla 99, which is called Godzilla 2000. See, it's like a car. It's named after the next year. Then there's Godzilla 2014, and now Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was the American title of the first Godzilla. You got all that? You good to go? Okay. Well, yeah, it can look pretty intimidating, but don't worry about any of that. If you're new to Godzilla but not sure where to start, the simplest solution is always start from the beginning and see how far you get. But what if you get 3 films in and find out it's not really your thing, and then you miss out on the ones that might have gotten you hooked? So my advice is that you don't have to watch these movies in any order. You can take any one of them, and sure, it might have some callbacks, there might be some continuity that carries over, but it's not going to matter that much. My goal is to pick out a few films that'll help introduce you to what Godzilla is all about, because I don't think the average person has time to sit through over 30 films. That's for the dedicated fan, and maybe that'll be you. But if you're a casual viewer, then you've come to the right place. For the fans who are sitting there watching like, oh, he better get this shit right, don't worry, I will. But the thing is, you're going to hear different opinions everywhere you look. I mean, look in the comments. I guarantee you, you're going to see every possible suggestion there is. But before I give my recommendations, it's important to differentiate between the many different Godzilla series. The original series of 15 films ran from 1954 to 75. Godzilla fans usually call it the Showa series because of its period in Japan's history. Then came a second series of 7 films, beginning with The Return of Godzilla, otherwise known as Godzilla 84, or Godzilla 1985 in its re-edited American form. It was a direct sequel to the original film, ignoring the rest of the original series. For simplicity's sake, it's basically a reboot. This second-generation continuity is referred to as the Heisei series, even though the Heisei period of Japan would apply to all the films that came after so far, so I personally like to just call it the second series. Then came the first American Godzilla in '98, which doesn't really count because the character is so far removed and has almost nothing to do with Godzilla except for the name. It's actually not that bad of a movie, but it's not Godzilla. Next, the original Japanese studio, Toho, started making them again immediately, beginning in late '99 with Godzilla 2000, which often gets confused with Godzilla 98, I guess because there were 2 reboots so close together. To summarize, Godzilla 98 was the American one with Matthew Broderick. Godzilla 2000 was the Japanese reboot. So this third series, which ran until 2004, consisted of 6 standalone films. Each one was a reboot in a sense, throwing away the continuity from all previous installments except for the original. The only one that didn't stand alone was Tokyo SOS, which was a direct sequel to Godzilla against Mechagodzilla. This batch is known as the Millennium Series. Next, in 2014, came another American reboot, which did well and is part of the new Monsterverse from Legendary Pictures, which includes Kong Skull Island, Godzilla King of the Monsters, and next, Godzilla vs. Kong. So if you're just now hopping on the bandwagon, there's a lot to look forward to. But in 2016 came a reboot from Toho called Shin Godzilla, which for some reason was marketed as Godzilla Resurgence for a while in America. So we're living in a strange time when there exist both Japanese and American Godzilla series overlapping. Of course, if Toho makes any sequels. So that's the big picture. That's what you're up against. You can attack it any way you wish. I'll give you my recommendations, but ultimately the decision is yours. Trust your own personal tastes and instincts. Do you like the special effects to be more convincing? Then watch the newer ones. Or do you like when you're able to tell how the effects were done? Then watch the older ones. Do you like 60s space adventures like Star Trek? Then watch Monster Zero and Destroy All Monsters. Do you like tropical islands? Watch Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster and Son of Godzilla. Do you like a little extra cheese factor? You want to be able to laugh at it? Then watch King Kong vs. Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Megalon. You want something experimental and psychedelic? Watch Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. You want non-stop action? Then watch Godzilla Final Wars. So they're all very different and can cater to specific tastes, but let's assume I know nothing about you, because chances are I don't. So these are my Godzilla picks for any human being. I'm going to pick 5, and if you have time to sit through 5 and like them that much, then by all means keep going. I'm judging these films based on the following criteria. First of all, they're all Japanese. The new American ones are most definitely a good place to start when it comes to generic audiences, but the goal here is to get you familiar with its source. Second, I'm only talking about the live-action films, not any other medium. Next, I'm looking for films with the strongest narratives. I want you to be engaged with the human storyline and not just the monster scenes. Undoubtedly, there'll be a little cheese factor here and there, but I'm staying away from anything too weird that would turn off the common person. Next, I think you need to see some of the other main monster characters, and if I were to narrow them down to the ones I find the most important, I would say Mothra, King Ghidorah, or Ghidorah in the United States, and Mechagodzilla. I'll make sure each of those characters get included from any timeline. And last but not least, I want to give you a sample from each of the first 3 Toho series. You'll notice how the special effects improve as it goes on, so if you're not a fan of the old effects, you might like the new ones. And now, on to the list. My suggested viewing, 5 films in this order. Godzilla, 1954. I think most fans would agree this one is mandatory viewing. I'm aware many modern viewers do not like black and white films, and the effects are a little crude, but you have to excuse it because it's the first time they ever did it. But the historical value of this first entry is so important that it overrides any hesitation I'd have in recommending it. It's an iconic film that's very dark and serious in nature. The human story involves a scientist who invents a devastating weapon called the Oxygen Destroyer and has to make a moral decision on whether or not to release the knowledge of it to the world. Godzilla is a symbol of nuclear war coming from a country that witnessed its powers firsthand. That's what Godzilla is about, and that's why starting with the original is the best choice. You have 2 versions to choose from, the original Japanese version and the American re-edit with new scenes starring Raymond Burr. I think there's no harm watching the American version. It's shorter for one thing, and it'll help expedite the process for the casual viewer. But if you want the more authentic experience, watch the Japanese version. Next, Mothra vs. Godzilla, 1964. My whole life, I thought it was called Godzilla vs. Mothra because that's what it was on VHS. It also had a version called Godzilla vs. The Thing, but I think that was back when it was in theaters. There's also a completely different film called Godzilla vs. Mothra from '92, but the one I'm recommending is the one from '64. It's important because it's the first time Godzilla met Mothra. It's not the introduction of Mothra. She had her own film beforehand, but I don't think that's required. The human story is about corporate greed. You have this rich businessman who wants to make himself richer and screw everybody else. Specifically, he's holding Mothra's egg hostage, and that's where all the problems come from. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but it's a very good narrative. You also see the military fighting Godzilla, only to find that he's invincible, and it's like fighting a force of nature, which is one of the key components of the franchise. Next, I want to leap you over to the second series with Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, or Ghidorah. Ghidorah is a must. Godzilla without Ghidorah is like Batman without the Joker. Ghidorah's origin story gets reinvented with each series, so it doesn't matter that we're skipping the first, even though the first is highly recommended too, and it was a tough choice, but I'm picking this one. And a word of advice, all the Ghidorah introduction films tend to be among the best, including GMK, so it's a really tough choice, but if you can only watch one of them, I suggest this one, because not only do you get Ghidorah, You also get Mecha Ghidorah. Yeah. This one's a little risky because it has a weird time travel plot, which is what I think makes it awesome. But also, a word of caution here, it has some World War II depictions that can be considered controversial. But there's so much going on in this movie, I think it has plenty to keep you entertained. If the Mothra one had you feeling bored and you were ready to go back to Game of Thrones or whatever else is super popular these days, I think this one will get your attention. Next, let's jump to the third series, Godzilla against Mechagodzilla 2002. If you thought the Ghidorah film was too batshit crazy, then you might settle into a comfort spot with this one. The plot is much simpler and straightforward. I mean, sure, there's some weird things like how Mechagodzilla is built over the bones of the original Godzilla, but the tone and the pace seems to fit better with that of mainstream films. This is the third incarnation of the Mechagodzilla character. I personally find the original character to be the most appealing, but that's kind of a cult thing and more of a specific taste. For the fans, I say, yeah, I love the green gorilla aliens and the Caesar song, Caesar, but I think that would turn off the general public. The special effects in this one are very clean. The miniatures and practical work are executed to the maximum perfection. The score is amazing and totally unique. There's many cues that you only hear in this one film. You have a very likable protagonist who keeps all the monster stuff anchored with relatable emotion, and the common thread of humanity's ongoing efforts to stop Godzilla is treated with top care. I think this is an easy one to get into, but it feels like a part one because it ends in the same manner that a lot of superhero films do, where it leaves you on a cliffhanger like the battle has just begun. So if you feel you still want more, I definitely encourage you to go right into the next film, Tokyo SOS 2003. This continues the Mechagodzilla storyline, but adds Mothra into the mix. It draws some parallels to the Mothra versus Godzilla plot, but you can now see how it looks with a bigger budget and modern technology. The destruction is top-notch. When monsters knock each other into buildings and you see it crumble, it just feels right. Everything that breaks, everything that explodes, it all looks so tangible. I think this is some of the best practical effects work in the whole genre. So, those are my personal suggestions. These 5 films, I think, offer a good sampling of the whole franchise, and after that, even if you find it's not your thing, you'll at least now be familiar with it. If you love it, then keep watching. I'd say whichever one was your favorite of those, watch the rest in that series. I had many close recommendations. I almost picked the original Ghidorah, but as I said, I wanted to get you to the second series as soon as possible. Many would say Destroy All Monsters, but that's only because of the last 10 minutes with the big monster Royal Rumble. Otherwise, the plot is kind of a rehash of Monster Zero with aliens trying to take over the world, and honestly, I think Monster Zero did it better. The first 2 Mechagodzillas, as already mentioned, I think they require some specific taste. And of course, this one, which is one of the best of the whole series, but it's hard to recommend a movie called Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. What were they thinking when they came up with that title? GMK, as it's known by fans, and is highly recommended. Final Wars, as said already, this is non-stop action with martial arts fighting on top of monster fighting, and just about every monster makes a cameo. I figured it's too insane for casual viewers, but if you like insane, then go for it. It also has a bit too many digital effects, which is not what the franchise is known for. Godzilla 2014, this is almost awesome. It has a great build-up, but in the middle it really goes downhill. Every time the monsters appear, it cuts away to something else. The human characters are bland, except for Bryan Cranston, but he's killed off in the first act. All the monster fighting is